Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode on the George Habib podcast. I feel like myself and many other people wonder what is going on here. What is this thing we call consciousness? What is this thing in our head? That basically determines all our actions in life and what happens to it as we go through all the various stages that we deal with today. Someone I hope will put it way better than I just did is my good friend Jay Nelson. Jay is the author, researcher. Sorry, he is excuse me, Jay. I'm going to have to edit that. He is an author and researcher into consciousness of the brain, as well as a university speaker at Naropa and Denver University. He is the author of the book Consciousness in a Nutshell with his wife, Lindy Nelson. And he is the guy I'm going to be presenting right now. How's it going, Jay?
What's up, George? Good, man. Thank you for asking. How are you doing?
Doing good, doing good.
Good.
And pretty cold since I'm based in Canada. Don't know if you got warm weather where you're based at.
We are in Denver, so it's still a little bit cold. There's still snow on the ground, but it's not snowing right now, so you got to speed on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, Canada, we're going into minus territory.
Yeah, that's how it was all last week here. So,
Yeah, hopefully it gets a lot warmer. But Jay, I wanted to ask you, since you could probably present yourself a whole lot better than I did.
okay, sure.
Jay, what do you do?
So I'm a writer, researcher, and a speaker as well. I'm most proud of a book called Consciousness in a Nutshell that my wife and I co-authored. It was a 6-year labor of love. It took over 10 years of research, but 6 years of active research and rewrites to get it exactly right. Because, the topic is consciousness. And the question is, what is consciousness? And this is the question that lights me up. This is the question that, gets me up out of bed in the morning, literally, because the way I spend most of my days is consuming lectures and reading books on the subject because I'm just trying to understand everything about the brain that I can, and then put it in a way that the layperson can connect and understand the question. Because consciousness as a subject is super, super interesting. However, a lot of the scientists that write on this subject write books that are very dry, and it's written for an academic audience, and it's not engaging. It doesn't make you want to keep reading, and often gives you cognitive fatigue. So within like a few pages, you just like have to shut the book. And I just kind of got fed up with this. I got fed up with reading these books that were just not written well. And so I wanted to write one that was interesting and engaging, and written in the genre of creative nonfiction. So that's me. That's what I do. I love taking complex topics and then trying to make them a little more accessible for people.
For sure. And Jay, I want to ask you, how did you start with all of that? I can't imagine it was something you went straight into right off the bat in university or right out of high school.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. So I was studying psychology at Florida State University, and it was like freshman year, and I fell in love with the brain that first class. I got my first C that I've ever gotten in my life, and I was like, "What?" But for some reason, it like lit me to like be better, and then I just completely fell in love with the brain. Now I was going to school for theater, for acting, because I was wanting to be an actor and a screenwriter. And so, after Florida State, I moved out to LA and was pursuing that path for years, and then had a near death experience that kind of like reset my brain. And the weird thing is I remained conscious during the reset. And so it was as if I got to see all the layers of consciousness, as I described them, get ticked on and ticked off at random, kind of like Photoshop layers, on a Photoshop on the side panel on the right. Like you can toggle on certain layers of the image, whether it's like contrast or text or sepia filter or whatever filter it is. You can turn them off and you can turn them on. And, when my brain reset in 2013, it was like I saw all the layers of consciousness, all the teams of neurons that contribute to this experience we're having right now, get turned on and get turned off at random. And it was chaotic. It didn't make a lot of sense, but what this experience did for me was inform my curriculum for the next 10 years. It showed me what I needed to study, what I didn't need to study, and what I needed to try and explain to someone who's never experienced their brain reboot.
So basically, you got a burst of inspiration by this major event. But I want to ask you,
Yeah.
Jake, could you give us a little bit more details on how you kind of achieved the near death experience? Like what kind of caused you to go into that state?
Yeah, so near death experiences are going to happen obviously when you've put your organism in a highly fearful situation. There's going to be a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And if you look at the current psychedelic literature right now, you're going to find a lot of overlap between a transcendent or mystical type experience and your classic near death experience. Now, obviously, when people hear near death experience, the first thing they think of is like, oh, you must have had this crossing over experience where there's like white light in a tunnel and stuff like that. It wasn't like that exactly for me, but there was definitely a moment of leaving my old life behind and choosing to come back into this one. And I hate to even say that up at the top because I try to come at this from like a place of science. And so, like whether or not you want to believe I actually crossed over or not, it doesn't even matter for the argument. What you need to know is that there are psychedelics being studied right now, and the reason they're being studied is because they can produce an experience that is very similar to a near-death experience, and that's what I had. So the year was 2013. My friend and I decided we wanted to take acid, except we weren't 100% sure if it
LSD.
was LSD. Yeah, we weren't 100% sure. It very well, the 2 times before I was sold DOB, another dangerous research chemical, as LSD, and it wasn't actually the real deal. And then, I tried it twice and it was the real deal. And then this other time it was from a new person, wasn't sure. And then me and this girl, we took a lot of it. And it became this point where it's like, the first thing I did was I took 3 tabs. She takes 2. She's like 130 pounds. I was like 180 at the time. So I took 210 micrograms minimum. The person said this was 70 micrograms a piece. So anything over 200 micrograms is basically almost enough to dissolve your sense of self, and really change your brain for a minute. And so I do 100% believe it was LSD now. But if you talk to me that night, in that moment, about 3 hours after I took 4.5 tabs of this stuff, it got to this point where it was like, this really could be 25I N-bomb, a dangerous research chemical. I could be dying right now. And I believed it, with 100% sincerity. I believed I was about to die. My life flashed before my eyes. We can talk about that if you want. But I mean, it kind of felt like a boomerang on Instagram, like the, the, the video goes forwards and then it goes backwards and then it goes forwards and then it goes backwards. Now imagine your entire life happening like that over and over, but getting faster and faster with each revolution, because that's what it was like. It was like a boomerang. And with each revolution, I'm sadder and sadder because I did not like who I was. I did not like who I'd become. I didn't like the person I was just being in life. I was a lying, cheating tyrant at the time. I was 25 years old. I was living in LA, doing the acting thing, producing a pilot I wrote, like everything looks good on paper, but like I kind of took this too much because I wasn't really happy. I wanted something new. And damn, I got it, man. Like LSD is something that could change your life, like probably will. And it sincerely did for me that night.
I want to ask you though, with LSD and like things that are similar, I suppose, like the shrooms and ayahuasca. So basically, Joe Rogan's grocery list.
Yeah.
With things like that, are you able to choose to remain the same person, or you have no choice but to, I guess, develop a whole new personality and outlook on life?
Well, you are in these moments, the reason why people take them and the reason why they're so useful for therapy is because they allow you to unlock from the shackles of time and space. Okay. So let's think about this for a second. We use our bodies to move through time and space, right? Like that's what they're there for. But we also use our minds. We can remember something that happened to us when we were 12 or 13, and we can go back in time and replay that and maybe we can reevaluate the situation. So in some ways we can mentally time travel. Okay. So now imagine that your ability to mentally time travel is hindered because you are not on one of these substances right now, because your brain is functioning in a normal way. You are not able to revisit some of these past traumas. You're not even letting yourself have access to these memories that you probably do. Like a lot of people will experience memories that they thought they'd forgotten about, but no, they were there. They were always there, and they've been waiting to be processed. So life comes at us, and it's extremely complex and hard and difficult and tragic, and we often don't process all the emotional components of the events that we're experiencing. And if you don't do that, it just sits there, and it's like backlogged information, like your taxes. It's going to get done eventually. You have to get it done. And if you don't, then a few years down the line, you have what I had, which is like an IRS audit. It was like my brain put me through an experience where it made me confront these, I call them the 100 icons of pain. Because if you can imagine your desktop experience, like that being like your consciousness, well, it felt like my consciousness back then had 100 icons sitting on your desktop that made it so chaotic. I was depressed all the time. I didn't like who I was. I was angry a lot. So that was my conscious experience, 100 icons of pain. And then during this, near-death experience, it was like I watched all those 100 icons of pain get defragged, like finally put in their place, finally processed, finally emotionally dealt with. And on the other end of that, my mind was so much cleaner. It was like, like I talk about like a reboot or a hard reset. It really did feel like that, because these memories used to be like at the forefront of my experience, like right here. And then after the experience, they were recontextualized and put away, and no longer was my narrative, like who I was, where I was going. It was so scattered and fragmented. And during this experience, it got unified. So it puts you in an experience where it's like, look, you're fragmented, you're scattered, your attention's everywhere. You need to console yourself, get your shit together, and then you can come back and live in this life and have a conversation like this,
Yeah.
But until that happens, you're put in a spot of limbo, mental limbo, whatever you want to call it. You're stuck in a spot that feels timeless. And I mean, you can, for the skeptics that are listening, just it feels timeless. It doesn't have to be timeless, but it feels timeless. You get stuck into the world of the subconscious. Like it's like your conscious self descends into the realm of the unconscious, and down there, it's timeless. That's how it feels. And so you have all the time in the world to figure out your next iteration, but you won't come back until you know what that is.
Right. And
Yeah.
those are the things that were going with you internally. Those were the things that you, Jay, yourself were experiencing from, we could say, a first person point of view. But to your friends and family or the average student in your university, if they saw you the day before and if they saw you the day after, how would those changes have looked like externally? Because I'm
Hmm.
assuming you didn't grow dreads and start listening to Bob Marley, and now you're always wearing pink, and now you believe in love and Rastafarianism and whatever. Because based on your background, I see you took a more scientific approach to this. So externally, how did that look?
I guess the next day I would have been walking around like a little more suspicious, looking around a little more suspicious of my own experience, because we in the book we talk about this experience. We break it down into 4 essential components, 4 mental rites of passage that a person goes through on one of these experiences. And that, in quick form, the mnemonic is DEMP, DEMP. So it's dissolvability, elasticity, malleability, and possibility. So the first thing that happens during a flow state, or during a meditation, or during a psychedelic state, is you get your default mode network, which is a large scale network firing in your brain that is responsible for your sense of self. So you have a sensation that your name is George, that you live in Canada, that you run a podcast. This is it's all part of your narrative and your story. This is your sense of self. It's tied up with memory. It's tied up with your experiences and all your perceptions. So now imagine that was like a layer of consciousness that I could just uncheck? What would that be like to not have that identity anymore? Because this is part of that experience. I
It
mean,
sounds a bit scary, but like some people would say you're no longer inhibited. You're more, it's not that you're more relaxed, but things that would stress you before seems to matter less.
yeah. I mean, literally in these states, you
Mhm.
can't remember them. You will, on a high enough dosage of a LSD or psilocybin or DMT, you will not have access to time. You will not be able to extract yourself from this moment right here, right now. The neuroscientist Arne Dietrich calls it, you collapse into a mental singularity where you're stuck right here, right now. And where you get stuck, it feels like it's the only room that there is. So a liminal space. In our pre-interview, we talked about, like, I was like describing it's like the walls of the room you're in got lifted up like backdrops on a theater. And then now you're exposed to the only room you've ever been in, which is the room of your choices, which is, this liminal space. And this is that limbo spot where it's like, oh, oh shit. Oh, I'm stuck in this room again. I do underscore again, because, I believe we're infinite. Um, so you get stuck in this room again, and then you got to figure out how to get yourself out.
Right.
What does your
And
soul need? Okay, go on.
can you tell us more, like, because I do want to get into these discussions where we do talk about consciousness and the brain and your research in that. But as I said before, you, instead of like taking like the hippy dippy route, as I call it, you took a more academic and research based journey through this thing that you experienced. How did that look like? Were there any authors you look back at? Did you read their work? Were there any papers you examined? Tell us more about how it went to tell us more about how you went from being a person who tripped out on acid, if we want to be blunt about it,
Yeah.
to an actual researcher producing your own book and coming up with your conclusions based on the studies.
Okay. So I was producing a pilot at the time, so I was very engaged in acting and writing and stand-up comedy actually at the time. So I was very engaged in that world. Now, flash forward to 3 years later, I'm completely out of that world. But for those 3 years post this experience, I kept getting extremely depressed because what happened was, I had this intense experience. My life flashed before my eyes. I was presented with what my life was, which is, lying, cheating, tyrant. And it was like, okay, now we have enough self-addicted, drug-addicted, narcissistic actors out there. So if you're going to come back and live on this planet, it's going to be something different. So what do you got? What can you bring to this life? And I'm not letting you out of this room until you have a good fucking answer. And that's how it felt, dude. It felt like that kind of ultimatum. You're stuck here until you come back with something good. And like it was, all right, I'm going to come back and do something with integrity. And I knew then in that moment that it was a life different than the acting life that I was leading. I was going to leave, I was going to not pursue the role of celebrity and instead pursue the role of hero. And, the hero in the, like Joseph Campbell definition of the word is one who, goes out of their normal, goes out of the normal that they're in, gets something from this other realm and then brings it back to humanity. And so that's exactly what I tried to do. This experience that I had in 2013, like, I don't like to describe it like this. I never describe it like this because it may sound elitist and I don't want that, but I'm just going to try it anyway. It's the experience of enlightenment. It's the experience of nirvana. It's the experience of a lifetime. It changes everything about what your mind will do and how it looks on the inside too. So physiologically, my brain did change. It started functioning in different ways, but until I completely unhooked myself from acting, I kept getting depressed because I wasn't putting my full creative force into something that I knew needed to be done. I knew I had something interesting to say about the subject of consciousness, but I told myself I'm an actor. I have no, like, I've not a lot of, I don't know how I would describe this. I don't have enough study to be able to describe this in a way that you could write a book about. But then you flash forward 10 years later, and that's exactly what happened. So it was just kind of like, had this experience showing you you're actually not going to be into acting anymore. Your heart's not in it. And until you realize that, you're going to get depressed. The second I realized I was, okay, I need to do something with consciousness. I need to do something with describing the brain and the mind. That's when I stopped getting depressed. That's when, my entire body started getting involved in my actions, and I started dropping into flow states in my own life more often because I was not blocking myself anymore. I think we
Right.
all
So
get, okay, go ahead.
I get what you're saying. So, but for me, what it looks like was after you had your experience, everything else seemed so limited and small because
Yeah.
you had a sneak peek about like the bigger things out there.
Yeah.
Is that how it was? Because when
What
I
should I
read
say?
about NDEs, like near death experiences from other people, and some people have a spiritual awakening, religious awakening. Some people are exactly like you; they go more into the science of it, not so much the woo woo. The recurrent theme I get is that after these experiences, everything they had before seemed so small and meaningless,
Yeah.
and then I don't know. For from what I saw, a lot of people, it seemed so freeing to them that then they just start asking like bigger questions. They start focusing on the bigger aspects of life. In your case, it seems to be consciousness in the brain. Other people, it's more about like the universe and philosophies. So that's why I want to ask you more about this flow state you're talking about. Because
Yeah.
when I see the word flow, I don't see that in the people around me. I don't even see it within me. I feel like we're all like mentally, emotionally, whatever you want to call it, constipated. But with you, again, like the imagery that keeps coming up is like a dam bursting or things letting go or things being left behind or like moving on to the bigger picture. Could you explain us more what you meant by flow?
Yeah, so flow states are technically defined as those states of consciousness where we are performing our best and we feel our best. So the author slash researcher Stephen Kotler has got a great book on this, Pulitzer Prize nominated book on this called Stealing Fire with his co-author Jamie Wheel. It's a great book because it really, tears apart the entire flow state experience for people. And so what he would say is that every Olympic medal you've ever heard of is underpinned by a flow state. And so, what are these? So let's say you are snowboarding downhill, down a mountain, and it finally gets to a spot where you're not thinking about yourself, you're not thinking about tomorrow, you're not thinking about yesterday. You are 100% focused on the task at hand, and there is no room for calculating time, and there's no room for calculating the self. So this default mode network I was mentioning earlier, that gets disintegrated. So it's not firing in its usual way. And when your sense of self, the neural substrates of the ego, is not firing in its usual way, you have access to more information because the ego is almost by definition something that limits your perspective. So without the ego, I guess giving you, the search parameters for understanding this infinite like amount of information that's coming in, you just get more information coming in. So with the conscious self kind of silent, then you're operating more at the subconscious or the unconscious, and this is what flow is like for people. So if you're a poet, you'll be writing, and then an entire poem will come out, and like you don't even know where it came from. You can't even almost claim ownership to this poem, and like you sat down for 10 minutes, but it was actually 2 hours. You know what I'm saying? Like, as
Yeah,
in time dilated for you.
you're in the
Um,
zone.
you're in the zone. That's another way to talk about it. In the zone moments. So now you had mentioned like, what is this different from being on automatic? The difference is when you're in a flow state,
Autopilot.
yeah, like autopilot. Yeah. So like, let's say you mean to drive to work, but you accidentally drive to home. You know what I mean? Like, or somewhere else, like you accidentally drive to the gym, like you just got on automatic and you weren't thinking about stuff. That's different. With a flow state, it's your it only happens when you are maximally challenged by the task at hand, but you also have a lot of skill at the task at hand. So And when it does happen, your brain releases dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, anandamide, noradrenaline, and sometimes oxytocin. So that's basically the 6 most powerful neurotransmitters we have that make us feel good and our reward chemicals, basically. These all get dumped in varying levels in the brain during a flow state. And my friend had a good point, which is like, you don't know you're in a flow state until you're out of it, because the second you know that you're in it, you've knocked yourself out of it. So these happen to me when I'm writing, or I'll be, writing. It feels like I'm sat down for an hour and then it's been 3 or 4 hours. Yeah.
And what kind of, if I may ask, what kind of works are produced by a flow state? Because we can say like you mentioned the ego. We can see a lot of like artists, singers, craftspeople when they focus on the ego, when they want to like fulfill like the rules they were taught in school and things like this. It seems to be that their work comes out pretty like rigid and confined. Like, okay, look, it's nice, you followed the rules, but it's not special. Would you say
Yeah.
a lot of artists, like especially like the abstract people or like the musicians who are kind of like basing it more on tunes and melodies, they're going into a flow state where they're trying to like bring out the what's going on inside their head and trying to like let other people experience what's going on there? Is this what you mean by the flow state?
Yeah, for basically any performer out there, it is that peak state of performance that you were looking for. That as a performer you're looking for, and as an audience member, everybody's looking for. When we go to a football, game or something like that, we want to see someone drop into one of these states and do something that no human's ever done before, no player's ever done before. When we watch the Olympics, we want to see what is a human anyway? Like, what are we capable of? Because what we thought we were capable of 4 years ago or 2 years ago is changed. And so, it's these flow states will happen when you have enough competence in the area, snowboarding or poetry writing or figure skating or whatever it happens to be. And then you let your inner critic go. There's no like easy way of getting in one, but if you challenge yourself enough where like your conscious self can no longer keep up with all the demands of what the body is doing, then your unconscious is forced to take over. And people report being most happy when they're in flow. Now that's interesting. People report being most happy when they don't have a sense of self.
Right.
Hmm.
Because they're like we said before, they're not inhibited anymore. You know,
Exactly.
they're not stuck in the material and things like this.
Yep. Not inhibited, no inner critic judging their ideas.
Right.
So it's high speed
So
creative
mhm.
decision making is what a flow state is. And as an
Right. So
artist, it's
as we
what you
said,
want.
as we said, the flow state is like the consciousness kind of letting go and kind of doing what it wants to do. But then this brings me back to this question, and I know it's a tough question. I know a lot of people ask about it in the world of spirituality and science.
Mm.
With you, Jay, I want to ask, what is consciousness? Because here we are talking about this thing, and we still haven't like stated the definition of what we're talking about.
Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. So one my one liner on consciousness is a dance between perception and memory. So you take the question of consciousness, right? And you're like, what is it? Okay. Well, the first thing, you have to draw a line in the sand. There are unconscious properties to consciousness, and there are conscious properties to consciousness. So the conscious properties to consciousness, I know that I'm speaking right now. I'm using my hands to make gestures. Like, I'm aware of a certain amount of information coming into my body at this moment in time, but I'm not aware of the millions of neurons that are popping off hundreds of times per second in my brain so that I can say this sentence right now. I don't 100% know the next sentence that's going to come out of my mouth, because a lot of talking is this unconscious thing that, I'm just barely aware of what I'm saying as I'm saying it. So, you just have to like make that first delineation that there is an unconscious property to consciousness and there is a conscious property to consciousness. So we can talk about the conscious property all day, but what's more interesting is unconscious, this unconsciousness that's driving the show. And just so you know, most researchers and experts in the field would put it at about 95 to 99% of your cognitive processing, all of your cognitive processing is unconscious. So do we know what consciousness is? I mean, not really, because we are only, first off, okay, let's do this real quick. A third of your life is spent sleeping. Okay, so a third of your life is spent in an altered state of consciousness we call dreaming and sleeping. So that's a third of your life. Okay, now half of your waking life, according to a Harvard study, is spent thinking about something other than what you're doing. So people are daydreaming as they're living their life. So this study from Harvard, published in the journal Science, says that we spend 47% of our time thinking about something else while we're doing something. So it just goes to show you, like, even as we are conscious, half of that isn't even conscious. So what do we really know about this experience we're talking about? And so this is what's cool about in the book is, like, we take this big question apart piece by piece. Okay, well, let's start with the assumption that consciousness exists in the brain. Let's start there. Let's see where we go. Once that research all bottoms out, what if consciousness isn't in the brain? What would that mean? So that's what we kind of get up into.
Right. And then, because like I just find consciousness pretty interesting because, there's a lot of authors out there. They're always having this argument whether it's based in the brain, based in the soul, or something entirely different. You have a lot of materialists. We're talking Richard Dawkins here, Daniel Dennett, Sam
Mm-hmm.
Harris, even. It's the brain. Once the brain turns off, the consciousness is gone. Then we have like a lot of spiritual people, which I hesitate to list, like if we're going to talk about Deepak Chopra,
Mm-hmm.
who says no, consciousness is in the universe, and you're just like kind of an antenna collecting some of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's like a special category for David Chalmers. He's a materialist, but he's a dualist, so I don't want to get there. I want to ask you more, Jay, like, what does the brain have to do with consciousness? Because when we think consciousness, a lot of people go towards the brain.
Definitely. And that's where I start too, because it just seems so self-evident, right? If my brain changes, then my experience of the world changes. And I mean, we've all experienced what it's like to be tired, like our experience of the world changes dependent upon what our brain is up to. Have you fed it recently? Have you not fed it recently? Are you on a 10-day cleanse where you haven't had any food at all? Now, the subtitle of this book is called a Psychonautical Odyssey, because I posit myself as one of the biggest psychonauts that's ever existed. Like, I love changing
Could you
my
just tell us what's
state.
a psychonaut?
Yeah. So a psychonaut is someone who wants to, stretch the limits of perception. They want to change their state. So, we have normal baseline wakeful conscious awareness that, that happens when we wake up and we haven't had coffee or cigarettes or alcohol or anything else. That's your baseline wakeful state. In the book, we call that CS5, just so you don't have to say that a million times. So you have your CS5, or consciousness 5.0. That's the same thing. You have your CS5, and then let's say you add caffeine to it. Okay, so I had some caffeine earlier today. So it changed my capacity for attention and awareness. So it just seems self-evident that the brain has something to do with consciousness, right? Because I ingested something into my body that then passed the blood-brain barrier, that then
It
changed the way
correlates.
Now you can also look into certain lesions and stroke in the brain and find out. Okay, so for example, did we talk about Dr. Jill Bolt Taylor in our pre-interview?
We talked about it in the pre-interview, but I am
Okay.
planning to bring it up right now. I just want to have your view on like what is the involvement of the brain on the consciousness.
It mediates consciousness. It's not the producer of consciousness,
Mm.
but it is tied up with consciousness, definitely. Now, in the book, we talk about how, like, there are 5 domains of explanation that you have to hit in order to have a fully satisfying theory of consciousness. So physical, mental, environmental, cosmological, and metaphysical. So just breaking it off, physical, you're a physical body. You came into this world because you had a mother. So there's a very physical component to consciousness, obviously. Mental, we just spoke about, if you ingest something that crosses the blood-brain barrier, then it changes the way your consciousness operates. Environmental, what is the environment? What is nature? You need to know what this is, and you need to have an answer for how consciousness contributes. And then, that just expands outward again, because, cosmological, The planet is, we grew up in a planet, that's our environment. Well, the environment grew up in a planet, that's cosmology. It came from somewhere, so you got to talk about that. And then at the end, it's metaphysical. What is beyond the senses? And maybe we should talk about some sense perception, because there's so much beyond the senses that it's really interesting. We think we see so well, but we don't.
How come?
Yeah.
Are you talking about like how we're missing like infralight and things like this?
Yeah. Yeah, that's one way to think about it. We think we know what light is, right? Because we've seen all the colors and it's bright in this room and stuff. But like I think we only see 1/2 of 1% of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Yeah, it's such a small amount, and we call that the visible spectrum. But other animals see different things. Birds have 4 cone receptors in their eyes, so they can see UV. We can't see UV. Bees can see UV. We can't see UV. Pit vipers can see ultraviolet, but we can't. Bats can see sounds, basically, because they're using screeches emitted in total darkness that reverberate off cavern walls, hit their brain. They turn that into an internal model that then they can use to catch insects and flies and stuff. Like, that's amazing. So, that's another part of consciousness, which is, all right, so we have consciousness as it is perceived by a human, but consciousness as it is perceived by an octopus is probably going to be very different, given that their sensory inputs are different. They have, like a shark, for example, can hunt prey using electroreception. So they, with their nose, they can send out like electrical signals and then get them back, and then pick up on electrical signals from fish moving. That's crazy. What is that like? How does that show up here? It's just something to think about.
Yeah, but that's the thing though. You're right now you're using animal examples like the pit viper, the octopus, the bats, but a lot of people out there don't think these animals are conscious. They think that they're just like responding to stimuli and things like this. Do you differentiate between consciousness and self-awareness? Is it the same, or are we talking about two completely different things?
That is a great question. Okay, so my idea and our idea of consciousness is that all animals, insects, fungi are conscious. They are part of consciousness. Now, do they have the same self-reflexive awareness that you and I have, where we can experience anticipatory anxiety and anticipatory regret? We can regret things that we haven't even done yet. Can a plant, can a flower, can a tree, their consciousness is dependent upon the sense organs they have. So their consciousness is dependent upon the biology that they're bringing to the table. Now, a tree sitting outside, we know it's communicating into the ground. It's communicating with the fungi that's living underneath the ground. We know it's communicating with other plants that are in its vicinity. So it's definitely involved in a dialogue with its environment, which is ultimately what consciousness is to me. But like you said, self-awareness. Does it have the awareness that it is a tree? Probably not. I mean, it doesn't, and so like a bird, for example, birds do complex behavior all the time, but are they aware of being aware? Can they think about thinking? Can they write a book? Well, obviously not. And the reason they can't is because they don't have the body plan. So where this gets to is that, like, we were bodies before we were minds. And in my interpretation, the body produced the mind. As we've talked about, I'm not a dualist. I don't think that the mind and body are two fundamentally different things. I think the body came first, and the body produced the mind in the same way that a ground will, let a flower out. Or another way to think about it is, your mind is your own, your body is your parents. That's one way to think about it. Because like we inherited a lot of intelligence and wisdom through our genes, and then it's just been unpacking and unfolding. And then we have this mind that, isn't it, when you're first born, you're not born with that default mode network all connected. Your brain is completely smooth. So all these wrinkles and folds, that happens as you experience life. Life literally leaves experience, like literally leaves impressions in your brain and on your organism as you go through. Even imagination changes the way that your brain looks like. And so I forgot where I was going, but something like that.
You're talking about how the environment versus like how the environment changes our bodies, but we're basically changing around the consciousness because you're
Yeah.
kind of
So
taking it as like two separate entities, the body and the consciousness, and then how the body facilitates the consciousness.
thank you. Okay. Yeah. So you aren't born with a default mode network, but around puberty, that's when it really starts to connect. Okay. So the default mode network, just so we're clear, um, it was first discovered when they had people in an fMRI machine laying down on one of those loud fMRI machines, and they had them focusing on like crosshairs. They had them focusing on a certain task. Do this, look at this. I want you to think about this. But when they didn't give people something to do, their minds started to wander. They started thinking about themselves. They started thinking about what they were going to do, 2 weeks from now on a vacation, or, that meeting that they really messed up, and they should have said something yesterday, but they didn't. And maybe they might get fired. So they started extracting themselves from the present moment and thinking about themselves or thinking about others. So self-referential thinking, that is what gives blood flow to the default mode network. So what they saw was, wow, this network in the brain that we've never seen before is turning on whenever people are thinking about themselves and, using mental time travel and imagination and fantasy. Whenever this happens, it turns on. But whenever they're doing something and they're really focused on it, it turns off. So if they're, really focused on basketball, for example, then the default mode network won't be there. And they could maybe drop into that in the zone moment, that flow state, and score 50 points in a game. That's possible. So
But
I guess oh, sorry, go.
to what, if I may ask, to what purpose though? Why do we enter in the flow state when we're basically zoning out? Is it like to kind of preserve the mind? Is it like a form of like rehabilitation while you're waiting, like your body's conducting some healing process? What is the purpose of the flow state?
I think the purpose of a flow state um is kind of just to show you that thinking, and so thinking, time, and narration, like you're narrating the experience that's happening to you as it's coming on, the inner critic, like all these things, those are luxuries of the brain. Like they are add-ons. They came on later. You know, it's almost like a bird is more trapped in a continuous flow state. It isn't, but it's like that in the sense that, if you can imagine what it's like to be in a continuous flow state, then you can imagine what it's like to be a bird or a baby, because you don't have enough memory and you don't have the mental capabilities of pulling yourself out of what you're doing and thinking about something else. You just, it's like juggling. Like you can only juggle if you have two hands, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you need two hands to juggle. And so it's
At
kind of like
least,
that. Yeah, right. So like, so it just goes to show you that like the default mode network is something, our sense of self, this ego that we develop, which helps us manage the external demands of the world, and is self-conscious, that is the ego. This thing isn't necessary. It isn't necessary. I'm sorry. It's semi-necessary. We need it to navigate the world, but if it goes into hyperdrive, this is what we call depression. When you have a hyperactive default mode network, and you look at this inside, fMRI scans, for example, and you see that someone's default mode network is hyperconnected, odds are they probably have anxiety, depression, or both. And so I think it just gets to the point that like, we coded our own brains. We are experiencing consciousness as we have coded this consciousness to come at us. But you can have an experience that changes everything and makes you recalibrate how you interface with reality.
right. So in your
Yeah.
case, it was the near death experience, which can we say it shed away some of the ego and recalibrated your reality? Or if we want to use the imagery from the movie The Matrix, like it got you out of the Matrix somewhat.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
And
The
I'm
Matrix is
referring the
beautiful.
movie. I'm not referring Andrew Tate. I'm just talking about the movie because
Oh, okay.
Andrew Tate uses the word The Matrix a lot too.
Okay. Yeah, that scene where Neo is like being pulled up into this like big thing of light, and he's like finally opening his eyes for the
Mhm.
first time, like that's what it feels like for real. Because, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about visual perception if you want to.
For sure. I just want to ask something.
Yeah.
When it comes to your research on this consciousness, the flow state, the brain, does it reinforce your belief in that there has to be a balance? Because I imagine both ends lead to the same thing, which is you kind of dissolve. If you're too much into your ego, which let's assume the animals are too much into their ego. What's their ego? Eat fuck shit, and then die only once. You know, something repeatedly and then something once. Like that's their programming. You might as well argue like they have no lives. But then let's say all that ego melted away, like it did somewhat with your near death experience, like with other near death experience I've read about. Do you ever feel like it could melt away to a point where you just kind of dissolve into consciousness, into the flow state? There's no concept of time, there's no concept of touch, there's no concept of like pacing yourself or action. You're just let out. If you Am I explaining it well? Like, do you understand what I'm saying?
I do. I think I know what you're saying.
Like, is that why we need to like maintain a proper balance? Whereas like with you before, you were too much into the ego, like focusing on the acting, focusing on your life, having too much anxiety and depression, I assume.
Mhm.
And that you were able to finally like this the steam vent a bit and open your consciousness through the LSD, that now you're actually living a more fulfilling life.
Yeah, I mean, a human is wildly complicated, and you could ask the question. It's like, all right, well, I want to lose weight. Why am I not losing weight? Well, to lose weight requires all of yourself to be in alignment towards the goal of losing weight. If just you come at this from a top down way, like, well, I'd like to lose weight. Well, okay, so you can use your top down executive control to skip a few meals here and there, to like maybe not do this. But if you aren't emotionally involved in like, no, I need to lose weight because it's the best thing for my family, it's the best thing for my career, it's the best thing for da 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 da, make up the list we want. But like, you need to be emotionally involved, and you need to also have this top down executive decision. I want to lose weight. So what this gets at is that humans are complicated. And so, we feel a certain way about our life, and we think a certain way about our life. And you also have two brains inside your head. Okay. Now, normally people call it the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, but it's more the case that these are two brains inside your head, and that they are both independently conscious to some extent. And so if they're both independently conscious to some extent, and you can look at the studies of split brain patients that demonstrate this, so a part of yourself has got a certain way of doing things and a certain way of processing information and harvesting. I'm sorry, and yeah, processing reality, and then your other brain is completely different. Now it's so crazy that like one brain could be a believer and one brain could be an atheist. That is an actual thing you can look up in the split brain patients. When they, you have these two hemispheres in your head, they are connected by a highway of neurons called the corpus callosum. Now, if you sever this corpus callosum, then now you have two brains inside your head, and they can no longer talk to each other. And that is what these split brain patients are like. So they have two brains inside their head, and where they normally could have talked to each other in the past, now they can't. And now you can ask each one a targeted question and get a different answer. Whoa, that's crazy, right?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
terrifying.
Yeah. So, but you don't, like, unless you're studying the right hemisphere, you don't know that your consciousness is composed of two interpretations about the world that are now unified. And in this experience I'm having right now, it's 500 milliseconds behind the moment. It takes time for light to come into your eyes, sound to come into your ears. They come in at different speeds, they get processed at different speeds. The sense of touch is the slowest. All this takes time to, synthesize together, because it's coming in different channels, different cables. It has to then get synthesized together into this unified experience that you're having. But that takes about a half second to do. Okay, that's pretty wild. But you're getting information from your left hemisphere and you're getting information from your right hemisphere. And yet, at this experience that I'm having, 500 milliseconds behind the moment, it's unified. But at the experience where it's actually happening, when it's like actual reality, like 500 milliseconds ago, it's two different, it's coming in from two different computers basically. And then it somehow gets synced together. And then it goes even further because your right eye is seeing a completely different image than your left eye. They're 3 inches apart, but it's because your right eye is different from your left eye and is seeing things differently that you're able to interpret depth. You're able to interpret 3 dimensions. You see 2 dimensions, but you interpret 3. You're creating this. So much of our perception is a creation. And when you have one of these experiences I'm talking about, you experience how much top-down influence you have over this creation you're having. And it just can never be overstated how much you have control over this experience. And I would never have believed it unless I was shown it multiple times. So it's hard to get someone to that perspective, but we try to do it in the book by showing them just certain ways of certain illusions, certain ways where their consciousness fails them. And you're like, okay, well, if you continuously think about it messes up during this illusion and this illusion and this illusion. And in this scenario, it's like, we're really piecing everything together, filling in the blanks, and making so much of consciousness up using memory and expectation.
And can I ask the implication this has on the concept of free will? Because we're talking about how, we're talking about the flow, we're talking about how your consciousness does a lot of things in the background that you're just not aware of.
Mm-hmm.
And that, if you just put a person on a chair, they start daydreaming, automatically, not even consciously, which is frankly a lot of things I personally go through. I feel like to do many of the biggest tasks in my life, I'm kind of wrangling stuff in my head and trying to squeeze them into alignment to get an action done. So I want to ask, based on the stuff you read and research into the subject of consciousness, what is the implication on free will? Because we have some people like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett. They're just oh, we're just responding to stimulus.
Mm-hmm.
Things are just automatically going in the background. Our awareness is an illusion, and we're just automata.
Okay.
I want to
Yeah.
ask, not what the people you've read about say about this. I want to ask, what does Jay Nelson think about free will?
I believe in infinity. And if you believe in infinity, then everything that can happen will happen. And so if you believe in that, then everything is almost an eventuality, because if everything can happen and if everything that can happen will happen, then it will eventually be the case. So in that sense, if infinity exists, and if you're living this life in infinite amount of ways, then free will doesn't exist, because the experience of free will exists, but actual free will doesn't exist. Now, I know you said, I actually like what Daniel Dennett has to say about at least one part about free will. And what he says is think about your arm. You can move it up, you can move it down. You can't move it everywhere you want to, but you can move it. So there's a range of motion that your arm is given. And that is the kind of free will that we have. We can't, if I asked you to just, this is David Eagleman's line, but he's like, go ahead and switch your sexual orientation real quick. Use your free will to just go ahead and change that. Or think about the person that wronged you the most in your life. Now just go ahead and forgive them real quick. Can you use your free will to forgive them? Yes, you can forgive them, but it doesn't, forgiveness costs something, and it may cost you all right, look, I can't forgive this person because they did something atrocious to me, but if I journaled about it for 10 pages, I might be able to forgive them. And that's legit. I need to understand why I can't see myself in this person in order to forgive them, in order to dissolve this ego boundary, this ego barrier that's put this person in the shadows and said they're different than me, and I wouldn't have done it like that, and they don't deserve my forgiveness. In order to access that forgiveness, I need to do something to get that forgiveness. So I may need to journal, or I may need to speak to them, or I may need to speak to a therapist. Now, I guess is what I just wanted to point out, that you don't using that free will to just forgive them without doing that work is the kind of free will we don't have. Um, Another way to think about it, also coming from Daniel Dennett, is like you're in a little boat in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of the Atlantic. Can you row wherever you want to? Kind of, but there's currents pushing you that you can't see. And that's another way to think about free will.
So
We are
basically,
given,
decision making within parameters. In the moment
yes.
you have free will in an environment, retroactively, it doesn't look like free will.
I think it just kind of gets to you have a set amount of choices you can make at any given moment, and it's not infinite, but you're likely going to go do those choices. One of
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's just a big question out there because you got tons of scientists, philosophers, researchers focusing on that, researchers such as yourself. So I'm
Yeah.
really curious to see where all those studies, where the accumulation of all that work leads us. Because again, there's times where I feel like I'm completely in control. Everything is the sum of my actions, and I decide what happens.
Mhm.
And then there's time where I don't know if it's flow state or autopilot. Flow state seems to be more creative. Autopilot seems to be more of a cope where, after just like working at a dead end job or something, I just look back at all that time and like I don't really remember it. It's
Yeah.
formed no impression on me. Like I can tell you like this was a period of 8 days where I didn't truly feel conscious.
Yeah. I mean, and if you think about the idea that like it isn't one self I'm talking to named George, but there are multiple competing subpersonalities inside
Mhm.
you. If you take that idea, then part of you was there. Your bodily self went through the motions and showed up at work those 8 days, but like the your emotional self that was like actually engaged or that could have been engaged wasn't. And so, did you remember it? No, of course not. But like, think about the time when or this is so easy, but like 9/11, like everybody remembers where they were when they heard about it because it was a big deal and it was emotionally relevant and culturally relevant. So your brain tagged it with an emotion and actually because there was emotional um because we are feeling, this is Dr. Jill Bolt Taylor's line, but because we are feeling creatures that think and not thinking creatures that feel, we feel everything before we think. Thought is a second order process in the brain. Because of that, um, your brain released like kind of like a cocktail that like dopamine and norepinephrine that sprayed in your memory system like basically tags of like this needs to get remembered. It's because of dopamine and norepinephrine, uh, the excitement of that experience that makes you remember it. But
Yeah, it left an imprint.
yeah. But like the cashier's eye color at the store last night, you don't remember that because unless she was like the love of your life or something, like you probably won't remember that unless it's emotionally relevant.
Yeah,
Yeah.
was that big of an impact? So
Yeah.
then, look, we discussed consciousness, we discussed the brain, we discussed how many different things externally can affect these are all explanations. But Jay, now I want to ask you for advice. You had a near death experience,
Hmm.
and out of it you seem to have transformed, I want to say, mentally, or
Hmm.
rather like your priorities realigned and you kind of focus on the bigger things, which is your research and the topic of consciousness and the brain.
Hmm.
There's a lot of people out there, my friends included, my relatives included, strangers, and even myself, we're just on autopilot. Not even
Mm.
flow state. Flow state seems to be more productive. We're on autopilot. We're automatons. We're just like working every day, earning money, and we're not even keeping track of it all because I guess there's really nothing to enjoy to keep track of.
Hmm.
I don't want to do LSD because even pot trips me out.
Okay.
What are other ways to achieve this flow state? And in what and not just achieve it, but harness it in a way that we don't just dissolve into it.
Actually, I think you should dissolve into it. You should let yourself go because
My ego
I
tells me
think
that's
it
scary.
well that's okay. So then meditation is where you get to ask, what are my thoughts up to? Like my ego thinks that's scary. Why? Well, the ego is all about control. It's all about judgment, control, ranking, classifying, listing. That's what the ego's up to. It loves to compare. So it loves social media. It loves to do upwards and downwards comparison. Oh, I'm more subscribers than them or less subscribers than them. Like, like I wish I had their candor or whatever. Like it's always judging, right? That's what the ego is. And so what's beautiful is that if you can experience a flow state, then what you've experienced is a miniature transcendent or mystical type experience. So with a flow state, you can experience the main lesson that you would get out of one of like my near-death experiences, except the lesson is way more pronounced. People talk about like getting in a car crash and time slowing down. Well, that just goes to show you like what your perception can do in a highly fearful situation. Hold on. I feel like I've gotten on a tangent. Your original question is, what do you do?
What can we do to engage in our flow state without dissolving into it? But you said we should dissolve into it.
Okay. So basically, what I'd say is this. There are two main essential modes of the brain. There's thinking and there's perception. If you are trying to drop into more flow states, you need to try to offline the thinking self. So the thinking self is being pushed along by this default mode network. It's being pushed along by this ego, this narrative self, I call it. If you can get your narrative where you're okay with who you are right now in this moment, like, why can't I love myself? If you can answer that question every morning with an answer, then you're going to drop into more flow states, because it is our ego that always is pulling us into the future or pulling us into the past, something that happened, something traumatic, like you're always thinking about something that was emotionally upsetting, right? Well, if you do enough journaling or therapy work that you are okay with your life story, you're okay with what happened when you were 14 and when you were 15 and when you were 16, then the memory system is no longer stealing your attention. And so the game of consciousness is ultimately, for me, about attention versus distraction. So we have attention and we are trying to cultivate as much attention as we can. The thing we want the most is other people's attention, right? We want to have someone listen to us, etc. So if you want to cultivate that attention, it starts with your own narrative, and it starts with, what is stealing my attention right now? Why can't I connect with George? Well, I'm thinking about something else. What am I thinking about? Why am I thinking about that? So it's asking these questions, and meditation or sensory deprivation tanks, and just any kind of focus practice. So, movement meditation or yoga or some kind of sport, anything you do where you can 100% focus on the task at hand is like gold for your brain, because it is the ego, the narrative self, that is kind of like a screensaver that pops on every 3 seconds. As someone who gets depressed a lot, that's what it feels like for me. I'm doing something, and then 3 seconds later, my brain's like, why don't you have this? Why don't you have this? The universe deserves, and it starts making up bullshit. It starts yammering and talking in my head. And so meditation is where you figure out, okay, how can I silence that part of my mind? And the more you can silence that part of the mind, then it's just a practice. And then you get better at staying in the present moment. And when you get better at staying in the present moment, you are not self-flagellating yourself with thoughts of failure and, memories of stuff you shouldn't have said or whatever it happens to be. So it's all about getting your narrative right and being okay with it.
And not getting too caught up in the ego, I assume. Like not letting like stuff like deter you from there.
Yeah. Cause like, it's ultimately about forgiveness for me. Cause it's like, the more you can practice forgiveness, the more intellect and attention you end up having, because it is that judgment that says, well, I'm not going to call that person back. I'm not going to, they deserve, 6 months of me not talking to them. That's not a thought coming from my heart, right? That's a thought coming from my ego that says, they did that to me. My name is Jay Nelson. Do they understand that? You know what I mean? Like, it's gross thought, but like we all have these things. And so it's recognizing this part of ourselves, which we call the shadow, and integrating with it and asking that question, why can't I see myself in that person? And that's how you dissolve the barrier, and that's how you connect and you love more. And that seems to help with your life satisfaction.
100%.
Yeah.
Jay, I can honestly tell you, you discussing the flow state, for me, that's really sticking with me. And it's definitely something I want to look into more.
Yeah.
And we discussed a lot of interesting concepts: consciousness, the brain, the flow state, things like this, the ego. I'm assuming a lot of people can have this very valuable information in the form of a book. Could you tell us more about that?
Yes, I can actually. So my wife and I co-authored a book called Consciousness in a Nutshell, a psychonautical odyssey. You have it? What?
Of course, I have it. Your
Oh
IF,
my
man.
God. Nice. And yeah, so this is a 6-year labor of love, everything worth knowing about the subject of consciousness, written inside a psychological thriller. So the genre is narrative nonfiction or creative nonfiction. And so there's a small story that kind of guides you through this topic, and a narrator who guides you through this really complex topic called consciousness. And so the essential idea is this: there's a neuropsychopharmacologist trapped in a room with no doors or windows, and he has 8 hours left to live. So he decides to write, after flipping out about dying, he decides to write everything he knows about the subject of consciousness into one letter to a stranger, and you're that stranger. So yeah, that's my pride and joy.
And where can people find this book?
You can probably request it at wherever good books are sold. You can probably request it at that bookshop. If it isn't there, you can always find it on Amazon, or my wife and I have a website. If you're domestic in the United States, we can definitely ship one out to you. Our website is consciousnessinanutshell.com.
All the links will be down below.
Yeah,
And including the links down below will be the links to your social media. Can you tell
cool.
us more about that?
Yeah, so we are at Consciousness in a Nutshell across all platforms. I need to release some more videos about the brain and that sort of thing. But yeah, we're just trying to explain some difficult topics of philosophy and yeah, thank you. Yeah, philosophy and some brain science and that sort of thing, some neuroscience. Thank you.
Awesome. Jay, before we end this video, do you have a final message to the audience?
Yeah, I do. So we talked about it when you're talking about consciousness, you divide consciousness into two things, right? The conscious self and the unconscious self. So there is a part of you that is unconscious, and obviously you don't quite understand this part of yourself, and this part of yourself needs to be understood. The emotional life of your life is what drives your existence. And so we think about our lives in a certain way, right? But we feel about our lives in another way. And so these are two different interpretations supported by two different brains. And so if you can get these brains to be more in sync and more in line, and just more likely to go with the flow that one brain is aiming at, then you find more flow states, you find more happiness, you find less resistance, because it is ourselves that are our own worst enemies, and we self-sabotage. And so that's what I've learned the most through psychedelic practice, or just going headfirst into altered states of consciousness, is the more I do the thing that scares me, the more I understand why it scares me, and the more I understand my emotions, the more mind I have to work with. Because as Dr. Jill Bolt Taylor says, we are not thinking creatures that feel. Biologically, we are feeling creatures that think. So we need to get our emotions under control. And once we have our emotions under control, then we're just better members of society. We can love more. We're less reactive and triggered. Why do we get triggered? Well, I've got trauma. Why do I have trauma? Well, I haven't dealt with it. Why haven't I dealt with it? And then you deal with that, and then you're a better person. I'm less reactive nowadays, 10 years later, versus, pre-2013, when I took and did what I wanted because I had a horrible view of this world that was nihilistic and incomplete. And now it's not perfect, but it's a little bit better. And that's what I'm trying to go for.
These are definitely things we need to think about in this, let's say, very egotistical, materialistic world where we get caught up in a lot of stuff that, frankly, isn't there for our well being.
Right. The urban jungle you were talking about. There's so much.
The concrete jungle. It's I feel
Yeah.
like it disattaches us from a lot in life. But Jay, I really want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for being on this channel and talking to us about the not really easy topic of consciousness in the brain.
Thank
You know,
you.
this is definitely not something I'm really prepared to discuss. That's why we bring in experts like you. So, guys,
Well,
yep.
I'm
Sorry,
impressed,
go ahead,
man.
Jay.
You asked some good questions, and you've clearly read a lot. So, yeah, thank you.
Well, you ask a lot of questions when you don't know anything, so I wouldn't give myself too much credit. So, guys, if you haven't already done so, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, share our social media because doing so helps us grow. The more we grow, the more interesting, I'm going to say 100% interesting guests we can bring on, such as Jay. And guys,
Right.
please follow his social media. All the links will be down below. And don't forget to check out his book. And I am definitely going to enjoy finishing up on this.
Nice. Thank you so much for having me, man.
For sure, man. Take care, guys.